Français sont champions du monde pour la deuxième fois dans l'histoire du football français. Emmanuel Macron peut embrasser la présidente.
In 2018, France stood atop the football world, winning their second World Cup in 20 years. It was an achievement that reflected the tremendous talent the nation has to offer, lining up players like Paul Pogba, N'Golo Kante, and Antoine Griezmann. In fact, France exports more footballers than any other country in the world besides Brazil. In the World Cup final against Croatia, France's starting lineup featured players playing in all 5 top European leagues. And yet, can you name 5 French club coaches right now? Can you even name 3? If you can, you're probably a fan of Ligue 1. If you can't, it's not your fault. There haven't been many French coaches plying their trade outside of France recently. Currently, Real Madrid manager Zinedine Zidane is the only one. This week, in an interview with Ligue, former Arsenal manager Arsene Wenger sought to address this issue. Today, we examine his comments and explain why French managers haven't had the same international success as their players. How would you describe the state of French coaching right now?
Well, on the one hand, you look at the fact that France are the reigning world champions and were led to World Cup glory by a French coach.
Tom Williams writes for Bleacher Report and ESPN.com.
The fact that Zinedine Zidane is in charge of arguably the world's biggest football club in Real Madrid and has won 3 European Cups there. And you'd think, well, it can't be in that bad a state. But then if you start to look a little bit further down, you realise that apart from those 2, there aren't really many other French coaches in high-profile positions at the moment. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And I think generally speaking, I don't think the stock of French coaches in general is particularly high at the moment. You don't really see French coaches being linked to the biggest jobs, which makes Zidane and Deschamps look more like outliers than sort of, leaders of a wave of successful French coaches.
Before we get into kind of explaining why that is, can we talk a little bit about the brief history of French managers? How have French coaches kind of fared in the past abroad?
Yeah, France has never really had any kind of tradition of successfully exporting coaches. You look at some of the great names from the history of French coaching, going back to Albert Batteux, the great coach of Reims and Saint-Etienne. He never left France. Jean-Claude Soideau at Nantes, he only ever coached Nantes. Even more recently, I guess you've got exceptions, notable exceptions, people like Arsene Wenger and Gérard Houllier. But, looking at the vast sweep of European football history, French coaches have tended not to really stray too far outside their own borders.
Yeah, I think I saw while researching this that Football France did a list of the 50 best coaches ever, and France only had 4 coaches on that list when Italy had 7, Germany had 7, England had 5, Spain had 5, and even Scotland and the Netherlands had as many. So definitely not really a rich tradition in that regard, I would say.
Yeah, you have French coaches who've had an awful lot of success domestically, but generally speaking, they haven't gone on to do that at other clubs. One other name that you could sort of throw into the mix is Elenio Herrera, who was a naturalised Frenchman, but, again, not actually born on French soil and not really considered one of the French coaches. And yeah, it is a curiosity of European football history that France hasn't had more successful coaches, who've succeeded working outside their own country.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that right now. Earlier in the week, Arsene Wenger talked about the lack of French coaches abroad in Europe and mentioned how Zidane is the only one. Can you give us some context, just kind of how that compares to maybe some other nationalities of coaches in Europe?
Yeah, so Zidane is currently the only French coach working in one of Europe's 4 major leagues, so England, Spain, Italy and Germany. Compared to the other major European football nations, France isn't doing that badly. Spain, you've only got Pep Guardiola and Mikel Arteta in England who are working outside Spain. There are no Italian coaches working outside Serie A. Germany, you've got obviously people like Jurgen Klopp and Thomas Tuchel, but there aren't many more than that. Portugal, I suppose, is the one European nation that has been very successful in exporting its coaches in recent years. There are 5 Portuguese coaches working in Europe's top 4 leagues. So yeah, compared to the other major football nations, France isn't doing particularly well, but it's not that far behind all the same.
So let's kind of explain why this is the case. What was Wenger's explanation for why there are so few coaches abroad?
I think the main thing that Wenger pointed out was the lack of a successful network of French coaches and French agents all working together and working in each other's interests. And you can compare that unfavourably with Portugal. You know, we know how successful Portuguese coaches have been in recent years, and there is a feeling there that given the influence of Portuguese agents like Jorge Mendes, that helps the whole thing to perpetuate itself. And France doesn't have anything like a network of that reach and that influence. And then another element that came up in that Wenger interview was French coaches being able to speak other languages. I mean, in England, we were spoiled really with Arsene Wenger, who always spoke fantastic English. Gerard Houllier, a former English teacher, who speaks, incredibly good English. But apart from that, you know, we've seen lots of coaches particularly come over to England from France and struggle with the language. Claude Puel being a recent example. Even before that, you had Jackson Santini at Tottenham. So that was something that he flagged up as well.
Are there any other possible explanations that you think might explain this?
I think there's a few. I think one thing is that you don't always know what you're going to get with a French coach. I don't think that there are stereotypes around coaches from other European countries, not all of which are entirely true, but they give you an idea of the sort of thing you can expect. An Italian coach is going to be good defensively. A Spanish coach or perhaps a Dutch coach is going to want to play good passing football. A Portuguese coach, you get all the tactical periodization stuff. You're going to get a good communicator. The German coach is also good communicators. Their teams play with lots of intensity, a la Jurgen Klopp, a la Thomas Tuchel. French coaches, I don't think you can say as easily, oh, this is what you get with a French coach. So I think that probably works against them. It's also probably a case of trends. There have been times when French coaches have been more desirable, certainly when Arsene Wenger was at his peak. And, currently Portuguese coaches are very popular, German coaches are very popular, and, French coaches just aren't really in fashion. And I think one of the reasons for that, and this is the problem that goes, far beyond coaching, but it's that French clubs tend not to fare very well in European competitions. Only one French team has ever won the European Cup.
Boli dans l'axe, Marcel Desailly au second poteau, et but de Boli! But de Basile Boli sur ce corner! Eh bien!
They've only had one Champions League finalist since 2000, and that is the best window for coaches that exist in European football. You think about what Porto winning the European Cup in 2004 did for Jose Mourinho. Even if they hadn't won the thing, he'd already put himself in that sort of shop window, put himself in the spotlight, and that's not something that any French coaches have really been able to do in recent years.
Let's take some of these reasons or explanations kind of one by one. Let's go and start with Arsene Wenger's network belief and how important those are. He said that they are critical. Can you explain in more detail how these networks function in reality and how certain coaches maybe rise above others due to them?
I think, again, just to go back to the example of Portugal, I think it's quite a useful country to use as a point of comparison, because the Portuguese Football Coaches Union has as one of its stated aims a desire to help Portuguese coaches working overseas, and all the Portuguese coaches working outside the country buy into that. And so you get a lot of crossover, between coaches, helping each other out, employing people they've worked with back in the day, whatever. And then you've got a network of influential Portuguese agents. I mentioned, Jorge Mendes. You look at Wolves as an example of what can happen when you kind of buy wholesale into that Portuguese network. You get a superb Portuguese coach in Nuno Espirito Santo. You get the players from Portugal and from Portuguese clubs like that an agent like Mendes can give you access to.
It's hard to believe now, but just 5 years ago, this city was in footballing crisis. Wolves were down in League One, and the streets were filled with pain, anger, and resentment. Now it's a very different story thanks to a little part of Portugal springing up in the Black Country.
It's turned Wolves into one of the best clubs in England, and France doesn't have that. I don't think French coaches work together in quite the same way. French agents are nowhere near as influential as their Portuguese counterparts. And I think, some of it comes down to mentality. I think with the Portuguese coaches, you get this real sense of, they're all kind of not to say that they're all coaching in exactly the same way, but there are certain common principles that Portuguese coaches tend to buy into. And I think it does create this sort of sense of unity and this shared desire to spread their vision around the world. And I just don't think France has that.
I spoke with Robbie Thompson earlier this week, and he's a commentator in Ligue 1, and he suggested another theory, and that is Aimé Jacquet, who won the 1998 World Cup final with France. He played a quite pragmatic or conservative style, and after he won the World Cup, he became the technical director of French football, and he was in that role up until 2006. And in that role, he was kind of responsible for coaching the coaches of France. And Thompson kind of reasoned that he thought maybe Jacquet might have passed down his conservative or pragmatic style to some of these younger coaches. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a degree of truth in that. I think even before you go on to the role that Jacquet took on after the World Cup, you look at the impact of what France winning the World Cup in '98 was, and the problem of the France national team, generally speaking, had been that over the years it had been a very flamboyant team that played with a lot of flair and a lot of expression, but it wasn't a team that won much. You take the 1984 Euro out of the equation, which France won on home soil. That was all France had won prior to '98. And there was always a feeling that, similar to the Netherlands in a way, that France produced very talented footballers, but there was something fundamentally a little bit flaky about the country's footballing mentality. And what Jacquet did with the squad that he took to the World Cup in 1998 was show that actually you had to give those talented French football players a really solid platform on which to perform. And you know, that, I mean, like many great teams, but that '98 team was a team that was very consciously built from the back. It was, you know, a relatively defensive team, and we've seen those traditions be carried on by Didier Deschamps, who captained that team under Jacquet, who has a very similar conception of football and who builds his own teams in a similar way. And, you know, you saw that in the 2018 World Cup. I think along with that, just generally speaking in French football, it's quite a conservative country in terms of the football that's played. You know, Ligue 1 is quite a defensive league. And I think one of the reasons is that because there aren't great economic disparities between France's clubs, if you take PSG out of the equation, I guess probably Nice now as well, now that they've got Ineos in charge. But, you know, certainly over the last 15, 20 years, there haven't been huge disparities. And so it's very difficult to gain any sort of leg up on the opposition. And consequently, an awful lot of French coaches just go out there trying to make their team solid, reasoning that if they can grind their way through games and pick up points here and there, that'll be enough to keep them competitive. You don't get French coaches taking crazy risks, you know, French coaches who come with a philosophy of a very extravagant, a very expansive football. And I think that's probably a factor as well.
So the idea is that it's kind of hard to sell that more pragmatic, conservative approach to kind of foreign chairmen and foreign sporting directors.
Yeah, a little bit. And I think also, I mean, communication is such a big part of football these days, and there's a big overlap between PR, for want of a better term, and coaching philosophies. You know, modern footballers want a coach who can sell them a philosophy. This is how we're going to play. This is how we're going to go out and beat teams. This is how everyone is going to fit into that. And on the one hand, they need to have that philosophy in the first place, and then they need to be able to communicate it. And I think that a lot of modern French coaches, they don't even have that philosophy, because there are very few French coaches who have the resources to be able to play in that way. And so given that, you don't get many French coaches who've built reputations on playing expansive football and then selling it to their players and selling it to chairmen and club owners, because there just isn't that culture there. And this is another thing that Arsene Wenger mentioned in his interview in L'Equipe, that a lot of modern club owners are not sort of football specialists and will rely quite heavily on agents and intermediaries. And so if you have agents who are part of a particular network of agents and coaches and intermediaries, it facilitates appointments for coaches in that network. And that's something else that France doesn't have.
When you were just talking, I couldn't help but think of Claude Puel, because he kind of describes a lot of the issues that French coaches have when he was at Leicester. You know, he picked up a reasonable amount of points, but he just had a rather pragmatic style, and he just couldn't seem to win over the fan base with his communication. Is that like a pretty fair example?
Oh, completely. And I think Puel encapsulates the difficulties that modern French coaches have encountered, very well, in that he had a lot of success in France, very highly rated in France, but it never worked for him in England. And I think a big issue he had, and he's admitted this himself, was that a big part of management in the Premier League in the modern era is communications, is PR. And when Puel spoke about it subsequently, he was very dismissive of that. For him, being a coach is the training ground, the tactics board, man management, nothing else. Everything else is window dressing. That's not the case. And this is what the UEFA Pro License coach gears coaches up for. It's not just the training ground, the tactics board, man management. It's everything else. And I think even in French, Claude Puel comes across as a slightly pernickety guy. He's not a particularly expansive talker in French. He has this very clipped, quite nasal way of speaking, almost like a kind of old-fashioned head teacher or something. And
Ryan will be injured. He cannot make a training session this week.
Because he never really got to grips with English, he created this very negative impression of him, and the fans didn't warm to him. The players, as we learned following his departure, didn't really warm to him either. And as you say, taken at sort of surface value, what he achieved on the pitch at Southampton and at Leicester was actually pretty respectable, but he didn't have the whole package. And that's something that a lot of French coaches struggle with, I think.
You mentioned some of the issues French clubs have in Europe, and that might be one of the big reasons why there aren't more French coaches abroad. Is that down to more coaching problems with French clubs when they get into the Champions League and the Europa League, or is there a bigger problem at hand with French clubs?
Yeah, I don't think it's a coaching issue. I think the issue that French clubs have is that, there is only one club with the resources to compete with the very biggest clubs in Europe, PSG, and for all sorts of different reasons, they've not managed to do that over the last few years since the Qataris arrived in 2011. And beyond that, Monaco reached the semi-finals in 2016-17.
The referee blows the full-time whistle, and Manchester City are out of the Champions League. The celebrations begin for Monaco, one of their great nights in Europe.
Marseille reached the Europa League final a season after, but they always feel like exceptional seasons. And no sooner does a French club have a decent run in the Champions League, again, PSG aside, then the squad gets completely gutted by richer, more powerful clubs from other European leagues, and the French club has to start again from scratch. So I think the big issue that French clubs have is that they just don't have the means to compete in Europe.
So finances are a big part of this. Can you explain what the DNCG is and how it impacts the ability of French clubs financially? Because I think it's quite important to talk about in this context.
The DNCG is a body that scrutinises the accounts of French clubs in Ligue and Ligue 2, and it has the power to impose penalties. It works in a similar way to UEFA's financial fair play restrictions, but whereas we all think of financial fair play as being a relatively new phenomenon in European football, the DNCG has been in place for years. And so, French clubs know that come the end of the season, if they have large losses on their balance sheets, they risk pretty serious punishments. And so French clubs were already obliged to spend within their means well before financial fair play came along. And that is another reason why they found it hard to bridge that gap towards Europe's biggest clubs, because it's basically impossible for them to spend beyond their means. Okay, PSG is the obvious example because they have spent very lavishly, and there are questions about how they've skirted around the FFP restrictions. But, globally speaking, PSG aside, there's not another club in France who've been able to do that.
But basically, you kind of have this structure in place financially that kind of limits spending and maybe disincentivizes some ambitious owners from coming to Ligue 1, which then kind of leads to poor performance in Europe, which then means less visibility for managers. Is that right?
Pretty much, yeah.
So how does the coronavirus pandemic affect Ligue 1 clubs in Europe? On the one hand, according to the DNCG, 15 of 20 clubs turned a profit last year and seem to be in a good financial state. On the other hand, the league could lose up to 400 million euros from canceling the season early. So kind of where do we stand in that regard?
I mean, as with all the other major European leagues, there's a huge amount of uncertainty, a huge amount of fear. French clubs do not make huge amounts of money, PSG aside. They don't have any sort of margin for error, really. So something like this, will cause major problems for lots of clubs. I think one area where French clubs will be particularly worried is transfers, because that is how an awful lot of French clubs sort of build their financial strategies, on the basis that they will be able to bring in a certain amount of money every summer through selling players. And, the suspicion is that the impact, or at least one of the impacts of the coronavirus outbreak, is that transfer fees will probably fall, that transfer activity will probably be quite limited, and that will be bad news for a lot of French clubs, and not even just the smaller French clubs. I mean, you look at clubs like Lille, Lyon as well. These are clubs who depend quite heavily on their ability to sell players. I mean, TV rights is interesting because once next season can actually begin, French clubs will get a fairly significant windfall because they have agreed the biggest TV rights deal in the league's history. Quite surprising. I mean, it was announced 2 or 3 years ago with a value of over €1 billion. And at the time that they announced the deal, it would have been the second most lucrative TV rights deal in Europe behind the Premier League. So that's something that French clubs have been sort of looking forward to and sort of budgeting for the last 2 years. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a fool's errand to predict exactly how clubs will be affected. But there'll be a lot of French clubs who are extremely worried about the consequences of it.
In the interview, Arsene Wenger said that it was a mystery to him that ex-PSG and ex-France manager Laurent Blanc doesn't have a club. Can you kind of solve that mystery for him? Because we haven't heard from him in a little while.
Yeah, it's really surprising. I mean, he left PSG in 2016, having won a clean sweep of domestic trophies in each of his last 2 seasons, couldn't quite get PSG into the Champions League semi-finals and was sacked. And I think the expectation was that he wouldn't have too many difficulties finding a new club because on top of all he achieved at PSG, he'd already won the league at Bordeaux. He'd helped to stabilise the France national team after the disaster that was the end of the Raymond Domenech era. And, when big jobs come up in France, his name is mentioned. He was close to getting the Lyon job last year and ended up missing out to Silvino. I think one of the issues with Blanc is that there's a feeling that he's quite an old school coach, more of an English style manager, really, in that he invariably would leave the training ground work to his coaches and sort of adopt more of a withdrawn role, similar to the way that Sir Alex Ferguson worked towards the end of his time at Manchester United. So, there have been accusations that he's not as hands-on a coach as most modern coaches are. But you look at his standing in the game, his remarkable playing career, the early success he enjoyed in his managerial career, and it's hard to explain why he's still out of work. I think he himself has admitted that he was, if not too picky, then that he perhaps waited a little bit too long after leaving PSG to start really engaging with job offers that were coming his way. But yeah, for him to still be out of a job coming up for 4 years after leaving PSG is, really quite peculiar.
So who, in your opinion, is currently the most exportable French manager? Who might we see in England, Italy, Spain, or Germany in the coming years?
I mean, one sort of up-and-coming French manager is Julien Stéphan, who's had huge success since he came in sort of midway through, season before last now. Won the French Cup with them in 2019, took them into the Champions League in 2020, and having only previously worked in the Rennes youth system and in charge of their reserves, so he's one to keep an eye on. Then you've got slightly more established coaches, Rudy Garcia, now at Lyon, Christophe Galtier, very solid coach who has been very successful at Lille after making his name at Saint-Etienne. Even think about someone like David Guillon at Reims, who's turned Reims into one of the most solid teams in Europe's 5 major leagues, but again, is not a name who really gets linked to the big job. So there are good coaches. I think Stéphan is probably the one. I mean, Patrick Vieira, lest we forget. I think if any sort of up-and-coming French coach is going to get a big job, it will be him, and he's already been linked with big jobs in the past. So yeah, I think he'd probably be the most likely to move into a big job in the next few years.
Should French football be concerned by this trend of French managers not getting kind of top jobs around Europe? I mean, even in France, they're losing out on the top jobs. The top two clubs, PSG and Marseille, are both coached by foreigners, after all.
Yeah, I mean, it is a concern. And again, this is something that Arsene Wenger said. I mean, it's, even before you look at the relative lack of French coaches working outside France, the fact that even the top jobs in French football aren't going to French managers is a concern. As you said, you've got Tuchel at PSG, you've got AVB for the time being, at least, at Marseille. Rudy Garcia's at Lyon, but he only came in because things didn't work out with Silvinho. Monaco's last two coaches have been from abroad, Leonardo Jardim from Portugal and Robert Moreno from Spain. So increasingly, French coaches are struggling to get the big jobs even in their own country. So yeah, I think it should be a big concern.
You can read Tom Williams' coverage of Ligue 1 on ESPN.com and Bleacher Report, and you can listen to him regularly on the Totally Football Show. This episode was produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And if you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.